Some analysts say Russian President Vladimir Putin miscalculated how the war would play out. But a New York Times op-ed poses the question that maybe the West is playing into Putin's hands. The article says the Russian president is more interested in taking Ukraine's energy. One expert calls Putin's invasion a guise to execute a, quote, enormous heist. And he joins me now, David Knight Legg. He's the former principal advisor to the Premier of Alberta. David, thanks for being here. What about Putin's military actions to date suggest he has not actually miscalculated how this war would play out?
Well, Robert, I would actually say he has miscalculated parts of what he's done pretty clearly. If you look at what's happened in Kiev, you look at what's happened with his supply chains across the country. But one other thing that we also know is that his army currently sits on around 90% of the assets that belong to the Ukraine with oil and gas, and is focused very heavily on controlling the one remaining asset that would give him control of the entire Donbass region, the Sea of Azov, the Kerch Strait, and the Black Sea, and that's Mariupol. And so I think that both things can be true. He's an ethnic nationalist. He hates democracy, and he has a real anger over NATO expansion, over the discussions Ukraine is having about NATO expansion. But those are the things he's told us about himself and about his motives. What he hasn't talked about, and what I think the current outline of the positioning of his army show, is that he is also actively trying to take advantage of the moment to steal as much as he can of Ukrainian energy assets and their ports, which would effectively landlock Ukraine. And it would give him access to an enormous supply chain of energy that would buttress his position in Central Asia.
Let's go back to a point you just made. You estimate Russia, as you said, to be sitting on top of 90% of Ukraine's fuel supply. Tell me why that's significant in terms of the global energy market, and how much more global energy dominance would Russia have if it annexes Ukraine's ports?
Well, if you think about it, so Ukraine has the second largest gas reserves in all of Europe. And it's not just that it's 40 trillion, 39 trillion barrels, cubic meters of gas. It's also that, cubic feet of gas. It's also that it's proximate to Western Europe and it's easily traded into Western Europe. Ukraine has sort of this strategic position. That gas at sort of today's price in Europe would be worth about $1.2 trillion. In addition to that, they're the sixth largest coal supply on the planet. Additionally, they have oil supply, but they also have very important strategic reserves in condensate and other minerals. They've got a large steel production facility in Mariupol. I think what's interesting is if you look at what he did in Crimea, you probably see some clues to the mistake that he's made by trying to, the wrong lesson he probably learned, which was thinking that the Ukraine would fall the way that Crimea did. But the other lesson that he learned is that the West soon forgets. And he stole an enormous amount of energy out of the Black Sea after that. He took control of all the naphtha gas assets, gave them to Gazprom, and literally a year later, the West was continuing to buy energy from him.
So if this was Putin's plan all along, could he be ultimately successful in his aims in terms of controlling that region? And what are the global implications if he does so?
Look, I don't think he ever planned to see his army decimated by a dedicated Ukrainian army supplied by the West, or to see Germany finally step up and start to pay their NATO dues and look for alternative sources of energy. I'm excited to see the Ukrainians push back this hard and have the success they have. But I do think that what he plans to do, I think he's very adaptive, and I think it's in his national interest as he sees it to try and take these assets, landlock Ukraine, and leave the portion of Ukraine that will be decimated if he is able to pull this off in a position of dependency. And so I think that what you're seeing happen now, and what probably needs to happen, is a totally new discussion on energy, climate, where Europe sources its energy from, and how we can reposition if, in fact, he intends to do what happened in 1938 in the Sudetenland, and use this opportunity to try and sue for peace that would leave him in control of the assets and the ground that he currently sits on.
In terms of moving in a new direction, is there any way for countries who have either cut or reduced their ties with Russian energy to maintain a relationship with Russia that's kind of complicated moving forward, whether maybe it's severed totally or not so severed? How does this look for countries that have to engage on an energy level?
Look, I think one of the lessons is that gas is absolutely essential. You know, Europe was able to decarbonize massively and reduce their global emissions by moving from coal to gas on the electrical grid. That's a super positive thing. But I think what we're seeing now is that you've got to be careful who you do business with. And both the United States and Canada, I think, need to move in a new direction to start to create a much more coordinated democratic approach to the supply of energy between both nations, US and Canada, but also into Europe. These are the two democratic superpowers. Alberta, where I'm from and was working, has more oil in it than Russia, the United States, and China put together. You know, it's the 5th largest gas producer in the world. The United States is the largest oil and gas producer in the world and has extraordinary assets. Together, these two democracies can have a huge effect on reconstructing the way that the supply chain of energy operates. And the other good news actually on the gas front is that gas is the #1 way that the United States has been able to reduce its global emissions by 20% the last 2 decades. It was the principal way that Europe accomplished a massive reduction in emissions. We have a huge opportunity in North America to ship gas to help displace the use of coal in the electrical grid, particularly in Asia, in China, India, Vietnam, Korea, and Indonesia. And by doing that, we can start to replace what Russia is trying to do and also start to move with commercial terms the Russian and Chinese interests apart, which I think is an essential part of where we need to go and how we need to use our energy, probably, you know, in a smarter way than the despots have been using it. It's really interesting to, a lot of people don't know this, but 80% of global oil is actually not held in democracies. Only 20% is held in democracies. But because we hold our energy resources principally in shareholder-led, innovative, entrepreneurial, free market companies that are committed to things like ESG and the climate, as well as responsible energy production, we tend to have an outsized effect on how much energy we can ship and where that energy can go on the planet. And I think it's an opportunity right now that we've seen Russia's true colors to take a much closer look at what they're actually doing in Ukraine, ensure that they're not able to use this moment to consolidate their power in the region, and ensure that we don't participate in rewarding their bad behavior if they sue for peace and ask to keep the territories they're currently landed on. But it's also a chance for us to work much more closely with Europe, who's currently on track to have 90% of their gas imported, to make sure that we, Canada and the United States in particular, fill in that gap and start to use our energy to create a more just distribution of resources instead of allowing the despots to take over with their regional ambitions.
Well, we'll be checking in with you, David, about whether the relationships are scrambled and reformed in the future because of these dynamics. David Knight Legg, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Robert.